What exactly is an object? You use the word object very differently from everyday speech.
An object cannot be reduced in either direction. It cannot be reduced to its pieces downward, and it cannot be reduced to its effects upward. Very good question. Alain Badiou being one of the most prominent, probably the most prominent living French philosopher, someone I think highly of as a philosopher. When it comes to the theory of objects, we have nothing but disagreements, I'm afraid.
If I were to give, say, wine to a cat or a machine, either it would die or it would just register acidity on a sensor. So in that sense, isn't aesthetics the most human filter imaginable?
Fascinating and utterly controversial question, so I'll have to be very careful here. Palestine, in reverse, in a way, many factions of the Israeli population want to deny the existence of Palestine as a real entity. They'll want to claim that the Arabs already have lots of different countries, and so there isn't really a country called Palestine. So there was a case where in France, there was some sort of garbage dump that environmental groups were lobbying to close. But then it turned out that snails had adapted to this garbage dump, and they were a very rare snail that had found a home in that artificial garbage environment. And so the same environmental groups were suddenly moved to protest to keep it open.
Professor, I want to stay with some of the criticisms your work has received, especially from Marxist and political thinkers.
The Third Reich, the Nazi government, that's an object, whether you like it or not. And you have to ontologically study it as an object. And at that first level, you're not making distinctions. So that's one example of how non-human objects create political conflict, can also create partnership. Other ways of compelling people besides military force and imprisonment are going to be a large part of the political landscape of the future.
For as long as we've thought about thought, we've placed ourselves at the center of reality, the mind that measures, the subject that gives meaning. But what if the world doesn't need us to exist? My guest today, Professor and philosopher Graham Harman, proposes just that. Through a way of thinking called object-oriented ontology, he asks us to see the world as a democracy of things, where a stone, a cloud, a circuit board, or even a nation all possess a reality that exists beyond our gaze. We'll explore what that means for science, for architecture, for politics, and for how we see ourselves in the world. Professor, welcome to the Dark Matter Bright Minds, and thank you for agreeing to do this.
Thank you for the invitation.
Let's just begin at the simplest level. What exactly is object-oriented ontology, and what is it trying to correct in the way philosophy has traditionally seen the world?
Western philosophy, since Immanuel Kant, who was writing in the 1780s, but is still a fairly contemporary philosopher because philosophy moves slowly compared to other fields. For Immanuel Kant, we couldn't talk about the way the world is in itself. The world in itself is what he calls the thing in itself. There's no way to know it. And therefore, we can only talk about the human experience of reality since we are trapped in human conditions of experience. So we can talk about the fact that humans see everything in space and time. Humans see everything as happening according to cause and effect. But we couldn't really talk about the way objects are in their own rights. One thing that's, I think, correct about that is Kant is right that we cannot have direct access to the world in itself. It is mediated because we are humans rather than some other kind of creature. That doesn't mean we can't say anything about them at all. And so object-oriented ontology wants to talk about object-object relations on the same level that it talks about thought-object relations. And another implication is that this means we don't draw a distinction between natural and artificial objects. They're both objects. So we can talk about flowers and trees and animals, but we can also talk about airplanes and institutions and cities as being real objects. So we're trying to broaden the field of what philosophy can talk about. That was the original ambition behind the philosophy.
Right, Professor, so then what exactly is an object? You use the word object very differently from everyday speech. Let's say something plain as the table, which you bring a lot. So what makes this a distinct object in your view? Is it the material, its shape, its use, or what is it?
For me, it's the fact that an object cannot be reduced in either direction. It cannot be reduced to its pieces downward, and it cannot be reduced to its effects upward. And if you think about it, every form of human knowledge reduces an object in one of those two directions. So if you ask me let's say you didn't know what a table was. You'd grown up in isolation. You didn't know what a table was. I could tell you what the pieces are that it's made of. It's made of legs and a surface, or it's made of atoms, molecules. Or I could go in the other direction and say the table is something you can put objects on. It's a place where people sit. It has a certain price. Now, both of those kinds of knowledge are very important, of course, but neither of those exhausts the table. Because the table is more than its pieces. We call this emergence because the table has properties that none of its pieces have. For instance, the ability to put objects on is something you cannot do to the individual atoms. No individual atom can support a drinking glass. And yet put enough of them together, you've got a table, which is a surface that can support solid objects. And also, you can't reduce the table upward to its uses because there's always possible uses that no one has ever thought of. And so it's not reducible to its current uses. It could turn out that I come up with some very, very creative, unforeseen way of using this table, which proves that the table was always more than what it's being used for now, which is a kitchen dining table.
Professor, if I want to bring in Ala Badiou here and try to understand the object from his, in his point of view, if anything could be counted as an entity, if we count it as one, the count is one process, right? Like, for example, things in this room, just by the virtue of being in this room, can be called an entity, and things that we don't count because of whatever reason is the void. So how is the withdrawal that you speak of different from this void, and how do you explain that sort of difference?
It's a very good question. Alain Badiou being one of the most prominent, probably the most prominent living French philosopher, someone I think highly of as a philosopher. When it comes to the theory of objects, we have nothing but disagreements, I'm afraid, because Badiou is very similar to Kant in his theory of objects. He thinks that the object is that which counts as an object for someone or something, whereas for me, an object might not be counted by anything, and it could still be a real object. There are objects out there that nothing is counting, and yet they are still there, just ready to have an effect that we cannot possibly foresee. The area where I overlap a lot with Badiou is his theory of the event. But for Badiou, it's very important to talk about very subjective events where a truth is revealed and it changes someone's life. So he talks about political revolution. He talks about falling in love. He talks about an artistic revolution or a scientific revolution. And I think this is all very important. The fact that we can go along living in a normal situation and then suddenly something happens that ruptures the situation and changes our subjectivity. And so I agree with him about a lot of that, not all of it, but a lot of it. And then when it comes to objects, we are a little more at odds because for me, objects have an independent reality that is not dependent on the subject, the human thinker.
So, Professor, you've given the example of, say, wine tasting, as, the way sommeliers perhaps, describe the wine as being flamboyant or having a lot of stamina, something suggesting that there is something in the wine that chemistry alone cannot express. But isn't that precisely because these adjectives are ours? They emerge from human cognition, culture, and metaphor. If I were to give, say, wine to a cat or a machine, either it would die or it would just register acidity on a sensor. So in that sense, isn't aesthetics the most human filter imaginable?
Yes and no. Humans have different sort of aesthetic sense from animals. We get a taste of the fact that animals seem to have an aesthetic sense. Animals will look at beautiful things. We've seen more photos recently on social media of bears sitting and watching the sunset. And I'm not sure if those are genuine photos, but they might well be. I don't think any of us will be shocked to think that certain animals have certain aesthetic senses. Many animals are much more beautiful than we are. They have very elaborate courtship rituals and feather patterns, and this suggests a heightened aesthetic sense. So in a sense, yes, aesthetics is a way of remaining within the human world of aesthetics. However, aesthetics, for me, hints at the reality of things in themselves in a way that prose language does not. So prose language involves what I would call literalism. You are trying to say the apple is red, the apple is hard. You're talking about a quality that the apple actually possesses. Whereas, in my view, when you're producing some sort of aesthetic statement or an aesthetic object like an artwork, you are creating a gap between an object and its qualities. You are creating a separation so that the object is no longer reducible to its qualities. It's become somewhat mysterious. It's hidden. This is why aesthetic objects are so alluring and fascinating in a way that everyday objects usually aren't. Because there's something there that we have to reach hard to grab that we can't really do. And so for me, aesthetics is actually the best way we have of getting outside of the human sphere.
Okay, so if every object maintains its own coherence, how do we think about entities whose borders are fluid? For example, like nations or communities. Does a country remain the same object when its territory or its people change?
To a certain extent. There will come a line, of course, that cannot be crossed, where it's no longer the same thing, but we're never sure what that is. So if you look at American history, we began with the 13 states after the English Revolution against England. Now we have 50 states. Is it still the same country that it was when it had 13? It's much broader. It stretches between the two oceans. We have Alaska and Hawaii, which don't even touch the other 48 states. you can always argue about, is there a certain line that cannot be crossed? But we can never know exactly for sure what that line is. So I wrote a book, for instance, about the Dutch East India Company 9 years ago. It's called Immaterialism. And what I
Hmm.
said there is that the Dutch East India Company went through 5 or 6 stages that I call symbioses, where it made a link with some other object that was irreversible. So, for
Hmm.
instance, there were 2 geographical locations, one of them in the south near Jakarta, one of them in the north near Singapore. As it gained each of those locations, it was no longer the company it had been before. And then there's an interesting one later where they had a shift in policy. They decided to stop focusing on trips back and forth between Indonesia and the Netherlands and started focusing on trade within Asia, whether with India, with Thailand, with China, and Japan. And in order to do this, they had to reorient their fleets towards smaller ships, since a lot of the Asian ports on rivers, the water is not very deep. And so they couldn't have these giant ships that they used to send back and forth with the Netherlands. And so when they had to change those ships, it changed the very nature of the company. I'd say, yes, it's still the same company, but it enters a new stage at each of those, with each of those symbioses. So an object can change, yes, and still remain the same object, but there are limits.
Professor, if I want to test this idea with a very real and complicated example, if we treat, say, Israel as an object,
Mm.
um, what is it that withdraws from us? What about it that cannot be fully grasped, no matter how much history, ideology, or analysis we apply? And what happens to the older object that occupied that space, Palestine? So, do they coexist as overlapping realities?
Fascinating and utterly controversial question, so I'll have to be very careful here. But yes, of course, many of the Arab nations in the Middle East, or Muslim nations, as I should say, because Iran is not an Arab nation, will refer to Israel as the Zionist entity. So they will acknowledge that something is there. I don't think they're denying it exists. I think they're denying the legitimacy of it exists. They know that there's something there that they are fighting. They're simply refusing to recognize it as a real nation called Israel, and yet they have to admit something is there because they're fighting it. So there is an entity there. Palestine, in reverse, in a way, many factions of the Israeli population want to deny the existence of Palestine as a real entity. They'll want to claim that the Arabs already have lots of different countries, and so there isn't really a country called Palestine. But they also have to admit that there's something there. There's a population there that they simply refuse to recognize as legitimate in the way that the Muslim countries in the area want to recognize it. So, ironically, both of them, simply by fighting, are conceding that the other is there. They're simply denying the legitimacy of the continued existence of that other object. But it's quite fascinating. And it will be controversial, but very interesting to do an object oriented analysis of Israel because they're also coexisting populations, not just the Palestinian and the Druze populations, but there are also very secular Israelis. There are hyper religious Israelis, all of them with very different conceptions of what they're doing there and what the future ought to be. But I don't think I'm ready to take on a topic that controversial yet. It would just be asking for trouble, no matter what. No one's going to be happy, whatever you say about that. So, at least the Dutch East India Company is 400 years old. So it was a colonialist empire that was a colonialist entity that was very violent and enslaved many people. But it's so old now that it's less of a hot button issue than Israel and Gaza.
Mm. I'll leave it at that. So, but Professor, for listeners who might find this too abstract, why do we need such a way of thinking at all? If an object withdraws and we can never access its full reality, what purpose does it serve to know what it withdraws?
That question assumes that there's only 2 options, that we can either know a thing directly or we can't know anything about it. Whereas what really happens is we're
Hmm.
all in a kind of gray zone where we know
Hmm.
some things about an object. Sometimes we can allude to a thing or speak of it suggestively. And this is
Hmm.
often more powerful than having direct knowledge about it. One of the most powerful things of language is the sort of language that hints. And I remember my second trip to Europe. I was coming back from England and I was being questioned by a security man. This was the
Hmm.
end of 1990, so it was just 2 years after the explosion of the Pan American jetliner over Lockerbie, Scotland, with a bomb put into a radio. So he was asking me these questions about Christmas in Italy, where I had been, and asked if anyone had given me a radio. And I said no. And then he simply looked me in the eye and said, "Do you understand why I am asking you these questions?" And
Hmm.
I just nodded. And that was much more powerful than if he had reminded me in prose terms of what had happened 2 years ago, which would have been true, but it was much more powerful to treat it
Hmm.
as an unspeakable yet still somehow speakable tragedy that had happened that they are trying to prevent. And life is filled with language of that kind that hints and suggests. And it often gives us more cognitive power than simply coming out and saying something. If you think about a joke, for instance, the best way to ruin a joke is to explain it. A lot of times you need to leave the joke as it is, and if someone doesn't get it, they don't get it. Or think about the movie The Godfather, where Marlon Brando always says, I'm going to make him an offer he can't refuse, which is a very powerful threat. It's much more threatening than saying, I'm going to cut off his horse's head and put it in his bed at night, which is what they actually do. It's far more powerful and threatening to hint. Well, I think the same is true of cognition. Socrates, when he called himself a philosopher rather than a sophist, rather than someone who knows. Philosophy in ancient Greek means philosophia. It means the love of wisdom. It means you don't have the wisdom, you're trying to get it. And you can never really get it. Socrates never succeeds in defining anything accurately, because all you can do is approach things obliquely or indirectly. And this is why we need it. We all already have a philosophy of the world. It's just that we don't always clarify to ourselves what that philosophy is. You mentioned Alain Badiou. Alain Badiou complains that the mainstream dominant philosophy today, he calls it democratic materialism, is that everything is bodies and languages. So everyone believes in a physical universe made of atoms, and everyone believes that each culture interprets that world of atoms differently. Well, Badiou thinks that's not enough. He thinks there are also truths, that there are things that go beyond bodies and languages. Whereas for me, the problem is you can't see these truths directly. They're always indirect, and you're never sure how to interpret them. That's our big difference.
So are we now surrounded by machines that write, compose, make decisions? Does artificial intelligence count for you as another kind of object, one with its own interiority and withdrawal?
It is. That doesn't mean I think it's conscious, because I don't. But I do think that it effectively functions as something like a quasi-human agent. And I use ChatGPT a lot more than most academics. For most academics, it's the sum of all horrors. We need to stop it because students are very much cheating using this software. And so I can no longer assign papers, for instance. I've had the students give their exams in the class, or I give oral exams so that I know what they know. But I found it very useful for things. First of all, as a research assistant, I can ask it to look through the whole history of Neoplatonism and is there anyone who said a certain surprising thing? And it's not infallible. It makes mistakes. You have to double check, but it finds things that I would need a research assistant working for thousands of hours to find. And so it really empowers me. I also ask it for career advice. Since all of my ratings are in the training data, I have the advantage that I can say, what have I done wrong in my writing career so far? Is there any topic I've missed? And it's able to go through it very quickly and find some very good suggestions for me that no human would know enough to find. So I find it very useful.
Are we so now living in a world where objects are beginning to imitate subjects, and what does that do to our sense of being human?
Yes, we are deliberately designing objects to behave like us to some extent. Luciano Floridi, the Italian philosopher, has called this agency without intelligence, because we can create machines that are able to do things that used to require intelligence and no longer do. I've also noticed that animals are adapting to us, and this is just anecdotal. I'm not a scientist who studies animals, but one thing I read a few years ago is that many animals are starting to become night animals, even if they were originally day animals, just to avoid us, because we are colonizing the world too much. So some animals have switched to a nocturnal lifestyle, but also animals are starting to imitate us by watching us. We're seeing here in California bears sitting in hot tubs enjoying themselves, or bears resting in hammocks, which were invented by humans. Or I saw one of a cat drinking from a straw, and I don't know if I believe that or not, because there's a lot of fake video now, but you can at least imagine that we are interacting with animals in a way that is causing both species to evolve more.
So in the context of artificial intelligence, and you mentioned it earlier, but in this context, what separates the artificial object from a natural one? So is it origin? Is it autonomy?
There is, of course, the origin. An artificial object has a human involved in creating it. However, once a thing is created, it doesn't always matter how it was created or who created it. A thing becomes autonomous to a certain extent. Now, that's not always true, of course. Certain human prejudices can be built into the way certain machines are designed. So I'm teaching an artificial intelligence course right now. And one of the examples that's given is that training data for artificial intelligence, since it's based on past data, often preserves past prejudices. So if you asked ChatGPT in the early days to write a short story about doctors and nurses, the doctor would always be a man, the nurses would always be women, because it was based on past data. And so that's something that's inscribed in the data that you have to try to cleanse if you don't want that prejudice going forward. So in that case, artificial objects do preserve some of the conditions of their creation. But in a certain sense, not. You create something and then it's out there in the wilds and it might start to act like a natural object. So there was a case where in France, there was some sort of garbage dump that environmental groups were lobbying to close. But then it turned out that snails had adapted to this garbage dump, and they were a very rare snail that had found a home in that artificial garbage environment. And so the same environmental groups were suddenly moved to protest to keep it open and to not clean it. This giant, horrible Pacific Ocean garbage patch that we're worried about. It's possible that certain sea creatures will find that to be a wonderful home for themselves. And so we may have to leave parts of it. So you never know when an artificial object will reverse into a natural one, or when a natural object will be enhanced by artificial augmentations. So it's sometimes very hard to draw that line between natural and artificial. I think it also empowers humans too much to think that we are so powerful that we can utterly change the status of a thing simply by intervening in it. A lot of times, no. We're part of nature just like anything else.
Right. But you teach it in architecture school, and I find that fascinating because architecture is where metaphysics becomes tangible. So how do buildings or materials express this idea that everything has its own life?
Very interesting. What you find is that the architectural object has a life that the architect never suspected. They expect certain things to happen when the building is constructed. It doesn't happen. So they may create one area where they think is going to be a seating area. We have one in the lobby of my apartment building here. Very comfortable. It has booths and plush chairs, but no one is ever there for some reason. And there was no way to predict that that was going to become a less used space. And so it's kind of this dead space. Whereas there are other parts of the building where people are hanging out much more often. So this is one thing architects face. And architects also will tell you, just like any artist, that the building starts speaking back to them as they design it. That yes, originally their ideas are what start the process of creation of the building, and yet there's resistance that they feel. Just as a novelist will tell you that they're intending to have a character do a certain thing in a certain chapter, but the character seems to be feeling like they're not wanting to do that. The character's wanting to do something else. Or maybe a minor character wants to become more major, and so starts pressing back against the author. So there are lots of ways an object that we create can resist our intentions and force us to do something we never expected.
Absolutely. First, in my own research, I did a comparative study between Badiou and Neruda, and I've been exploring what I call the subjectivized object. When an object, through human fidelity or attention, becomes charged with subjectivity, a book, a landscape, or a nation, something that begins to act through our devotion to it. How would Triple O see that?
Unfortunately, my knowledge of Neruda is not as good as I would like it to be, but I could see subjectivized objects. And of course, one way this happens is when objects become encrusted with memories. That an object becomes something more, say a battlefield or a place where an important ceremony took place in your own life. These, yes, in a way, these are merely subjective, but they become a part of the landscape and in a way that can be passed on to future generations of humans. They can become sacred spaces. So that's one way I would look at it, I think, is look at what makes certain places become memorable and cause a certain respect or awe or fear as we approach them because something happened there.
Professor, I want to stay with some of the criticisms your work has received, especially from Marxist and political thinkers. They often argue that by treating all things equally, a person, a factory, a coastline, a coin, becomes politically quiet. It refuses to distinguish between oppression and resistance, between the human who suffers and the system that causes it. So it kind of flattens the world at the cost of justice. So how do you respond to that?
I do have some responses to that. The first thing I would say is that object-oriented ontology is an ontology. So when we flatten things, that's not flattening things politically and ethically. It's just saying that the Third Reich, the Nazi government, that's an object, whether you like it or not. And you have to ontologically study it as an object. And at that first level, you're not making distinctions, right? You're not immediately passing political and ethical judgment on things. You're simply looking at how they are as objects. Now, of course, ethics and politics also exist. We're not saying that this kitchen table has the same ethical rights that a human would. I obviously have an ethical obligation to humans that I don't have to inanimate objects. However, I think the human anthropocentric standpoint has infected political theory in the modern period. And I'll explain it this way. Modern Modern politics really is organized around this axis between left and right. This has been going at least since the French Revolution, where there were two sides of the assembly. The left side was the more radical side, the right side was the more conservative side. What the left and the right agree on, even though they disagree on everything, is that politics should be based on a specific theory of human nature. So for the left, humans are naturally free. And if we are oppressed, this is an affront against the natural state of things. Either society is corrupting us or some evil oppressive class is smashing people, and therefore we must rise up and liberate ourselves from it. This is the left position, whether it's Marx or Rousseau, or a more moderate version like the American founders rebelling against England. On the other hand, you've got the right. The right sees human beings as being very dangerous animals, that we never really change or improve over the centuries. A certain amount of force is needed to keep us in place, and therefore we need harsh police, we need harsh military responses to enemies. All right, so we kind of swing back and forth between these two as politics moves through history. But what if human nature isn't really the key to political theory? Consider the fact that human society is structured by inanimate objects. Geography is the first great example. Certain political units tend to form because they are geographically natural units, such as an island nation like the UK or like Japan. These nations have a certain isolation that makes them seem like natural units. There's one population there. Certain nations seem to be natural enemies because they are positioned next to each other with certain resources that they both can't have. Think about for example, the Nile River, which goes from Lake Victoria in Uganda down through the Sudan, branch goes through Ethiopia all the way through Egypt. Well, people aren't talking about this much yet outside of Africa, but there are likely future conflicts coming over Nile water as global warming increases the need for water supply. You could have conflicts between Egypt and, say, Sudan and Ethiopia simply over water supplies. Well, so then for many decades, Egypt was always in conflict with Israel for ideological reasons involving Palestine. That may change so that Egypt's survival hinges instead on water and its neighbors on the river. There was almost a war between Syria and Turkey in 1996 over Tigris and Euphrates water that was just barely averted. So that's one example of how non-human objects create political conflict, but can also create partnership. And then, of course, the main example of this will be climate change. We're going to need new forms of government to deal with climate change. Some people think we're going to need a world government because obviously you can't have each country making its own rules about carbon dioxide because it affects us all. The problem with world government, as some have pointed out, is that it could become world dictatorship. And so there's a certain advantage in not having a world government. So I've been looking at alternatives to governments as ways of encouraging compliance with climate regulations, for instance. And we already have some things like this. They're not ideal, but they're models for how we might proceed. For instance, in international sports, we have FIFA, or we have the International Olympic Committee, which don't have the power to put anyone in prison. They don't have any military force, and yet they are able to withhold prestige from certain countries. So if you are doing something bad politically, they can prevent your country from being in the Olympics the next time, and countries want to be in the Olympics. And so that's a certain incentive that has certain consequences. We're going to need stronger organizations and more trustworthy ones than FIFA and the International Olympic Committee. But I think other ways of compelling people besides military force and imprisonment are going to be a large part of the political landscape of the future. I look forward to helping develop some of those theoretically.
Just want to push it a little further. Like, for example, if I were to study some objects, like if Marxism takes us to the factory, the place where things are made, broken, or fought over, while Triple O would take us probably to a museum where the same things now stand quietly as independent beings. Both are true views of the world, but they serve different purposes. Did you worry that philosophy, when it retreats into the museum or into aesthetics, it abandons the material struggle that gave critical theory its urgency?
No, because I would say instead of going to the museum, I would go to the wetland or to go to some other ecological setting that is next to human things and look at how they interact and how can we improve their interaction. So I think critical theory is actually the wrong model. Critical theory is a modern model based on the idea that humans are alienated in a world that is different from us and that politics is primarily about humans oppressing other humans. I don't think it's like that. I think humans are entangled with other things. And yes, there is human oppression that we need to deal with, but I don't think that necessarily needs to be the absolute center of political activism. So I have philosophical disagreements with the critical theorists.
Right. So after all this, well, we've come to the end. I keep thinking about the human condition in your philosophy. If every object withdraws, even us, so what happens to solidarity? Can there still be collective action in a world where we never fully know one another?
Yes, I think actually human interaction is better when we respect the distance and difference other people have from us. That we don't try to submit them to our conception of what humans should be or what human interaction should be. This is one of the reasons that it's always good when foreign cultures interact, because there are certain misunderstandings, but they can be productive misunderstandings because we can realize, oh, there's something going on here that I don't quite grasp.
Hmm.
This is one reason I always travel. This is one reason I liked living abroad in Egypt. I worked there for 16 years. That you never learn more than when you are immersed in a foreign culture.
Right, Professor. Well, thank you. What object-oriented ontology finally asks us, maybe it's maybe both of humility and courage to see that the world is deeper than our systems of thought, and yet to act, knowing we'll never see it whole.
Mhm.
To hold in one hand the mystery of being, and in the other the weight of consequence. Perhaps the task of philosophy now is to keep wonder and justice in the same frame. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.